Hello, and welcome to today's OAUG Vendor Awareness Session hosted by Solix Technologies, where we will be discussing database auditing and security in today's heterogeneous environment, and specifically talking about how to deploy consistent security policies across application data. My name is Julie Lochner. I'm Vice President of Sales Operations for Solix, and today we will review sources of commonly overlooked security risks in your database environment, how combining best practices in database security, audit, and archive can help organizations protect themselves from data breaches, and then we'll review how Solix Technology specifically helps companies deploy, enforce, and audit consistent security policies across multiple database applications, including ERP and custom. You know, in today's litigious society, we all need to look at what kind of data we need to protect and what data is considered sensitive. You know, the Enterprise Strategy Group, or ESG, estimates that on average 54% of your database data is considered confidential. Forrester Group estimates that 80% of all security breaches are from insiders. You know, I look at sensitive data and company confidential data. It's anything that you may not want to have exposed outside of the people who have authorized access to it. So, for example, sensitive data. If you're in retail, you've got credit card information, or customer address, driver's license number. If you're like in the rental car business, you know, patient data. If you're any healthcare system, social security number, personnel data, payroll. You know, that's sensitive data that's regulated. But look at all the other information that's in your corporate databases that you may not want to get exposed outside of that, you know, production environment. Manufacturing and trade data. If you're in the food industry, you probably have some secret recipe. You know, clinical trials in the pharmaceutical industry. Or just what about, you know, general financial data? You know, your GL or financial reports, or even worse, your competitive information. Who are your customers? Your sales pipeline, forecasts, competitive information, and disadvantages. All this information is data that not only resides in your production environment, but also resides in all the copies that you make for patch, test, development. So where are the risks? You know, production applications, usually the risk is, you know, it can be categorized in a couple different ways: outsider attacks on servers, or insiders. How could the insiders get access to your production system or access to production data? You know, what about the clones that you make for your disaster recovery or your reporting copies? You know, a lot of times data is replicated to a completely, you know, separated physical site somewhere else, or you've got reporting copies that you open up for people who are running analysis on them. You also have most likely production support copies. These are your patch, test, development, all the copies that you need to support that production instance. You have support teams who have access to all that data. You may have disgruntled employees that used to have access to all that data. You know, sometimes what employees will do is they'll create small test data sets on their local desktops just to play around with a new feature or test out a new patch. Again, these are all copies that may contain sensitive or company confidential information. You know, now with everybody looking at outsourcing support or even data centers, you know, in its entirety, now you have, you know, the non-employees having access to data. If you use offshore development, a lot of times, you know, what companies will do is they'll take copies from backups and they'll send out those copies to the development center without making any modifications or any additional security scripts against the data. So, you know, there's a lot of risks, and you have to think of not only just production, but all of the clones and all of the people who may have access to that data. So what do most data centers do today? Well, you have your production environment with all that sensitive data and information in it, and you know, in most cases, this is the environment that is protected the most. It has all of the security bells and whistles to protect the perimeter, to protect the data between the database and the application. It's all encrypted, but that same database environment is also being cloned to some standby or disaster recovery site, or maybe you're using a tape backup to restore, to create your clones for your reporting or test development. Or maybe you're a little bit more sophisticated and you use business continuous volumes to create your clones or scan copy. Or maybe you're using an offshore data center or support center, and you're taking those backups and you're shipping them off-site to do offshore development, or maybe you're sending it to Iron Mountain for archive. But wherever that data is getting copied to or restored, in most cases, what we've seen is that the environment is less secure than that production environment, both from a physical perspective as well as from a personnel perspective. This is where our focus is, especially in this day and age where everybody's looking at where is the data. And, this is definitely an area of risk. So the best way to get your arms around it is to start combining, a few best practices. You're probably doing a lot of these already, but if you think about, securing the entire process and the entire environment, you need to do a couple of things. The first is common sense, is harden that production environment. But we also want to look at applying that same policy to your reporting copies and your DR site. And this includes things like encryption and personnel security policies, password, control. Again, this is probably most of you guys are doing this already. But the additional pieces are, what you need to combine are implementing audit controls in your production and during cloning, making sure that if you have sensitive data in specific tables, put some controls around there so that you know who's accessing what data, if it's changing, that's changing in the proper way. And when you do make those clones, what's happening, where is it going, and keep an electronic paper trail. This is where auditors are really targeting where the risk and vulnerabilities are is in that cloning process. So you want to have an audit control process in place during the cloning process. Another best practice is if you have sensitive data in your test and development environment and you don't need to have the original values to complete your test and development processes, mask or remove the data. Just eliminate the risk altogether. And this is something that can be done pretty straightforward. We'll talk a little bit more about that coming forward. And another way to start to get your arms around it is archive data that's eligible. The problem becomes a lot more manageable when your data volumes and your growth is in check. And we'll talk a little bit more about this too. So what does this look like when you put it all together? It's best practices in securing and auditing and archiving your environment. So on the left-hand side, we're talking about expanding that security policy to include all of those production environments, including your DR site. Put the production, the reporting copy, your standby or your BCVs, as well as your archive database, all with the same SLA. If it has sensitive data and it's production data, make sure that you extend all of your perimeter controls and audit controls around all of these instances, and separate those applications from your production support. So you know who's going to be accessing it, and you can control the user access. The second thing is audit. Audit the data, audit my data, make sure that you know who's accessing what data, and have that audit trail so that when you do create that clone, you want to have a trail that shows that these are all the steps that I took to create the clone, and then mask it automatically before you release it to your DBAs or to your test and development team. You can combine things like masking and subsetting in the cloning process so that you can also see some lower total costs by creating smaller, secure databases that can be replicated in less time, mitigating risk. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about how do you get there. So hardening your production and reporting and DR and archive environment. There's two notions of encryption. One is encrypting data in motion, and the other one is encrypting data at rest. And so for those of you who may be familiar with this process, this will be a little old hat for you. But for those, this is just to give a quick introduction to what we're talking about. So when you talk about encrypting data in motion, that means that in your production environment, you'll say have your customer's name and credit card information, but the data residing in those tables are clear text. But what happens is when you want to send that credit card information to another application for some other reason, there's some type of key, an encryption process that goes between the two applications. But when the application, on the target side receives that data, it's actually sitting in that database and in clear text. Typically encryption in motion is done between B2B applications or between the application server and the database itself. A better way to approach encrypting, sensitive information in your production environment is to look at encrypting it at rest. And this means instead of putting the keys, between the network and at the perimeter, it's really protecting the data when it's sitting in the database itself. In this scenario, the key is and the decoding is done between the application and the actual database itself. There are some questions as if it does impact the production performance, and in some cases it does. Oracle is getting a lot better with their encryption capability. I know in their next version 11 on the database, they're touting significant performance improvements on that encryption. But this is really a better approach for when you have really sensitive data that's going to be sitting in that database environment. And I mean, emotion is great to protect outsiders from accessing it when it's going across the pipe, but if you want to protect that data at rest from insiders, encrypting it in a database is really your best bet. Okay, let's move on to some approaches for auditing. There are three general approaches for implementing audit controls in your database, and we'll talk a little bit about these. The first one is using or leveraging native database triggers. Some of the database vendors have, embedded audit trigger capability, like Oracle has your $V audit environment or options. But the way that the audit triggers work is that you define the tables and the columns that you want to have the trigger on, and you have a trigger that looks for an event. So, like for example, on delete or on insert or on update. But every time that event occurs, and that tagged object, it'll write specific information about the event to like an audit table within the database. This is great, because it really gets close to the database, and no matter how someone gets into the environment, you're actually grabbing control. There are some concern about using triggers that impacts performance, but you're not having triggers on every single column and every single table in the database. It's really targeting those that need to have the data audited. And you can put filters on the triggers so that it's only firing when something unusual occurs. Another approach to auditing is using like a network sniffer technology. Like there's a couple companies out there that use an appliance approach or have daemons running on the database server that sniff the network. And what this does is that it decodes all of the SQL that's coming in and out of that application environment. I mean, these are great for high volume traffic. It's really easy. It doesn't require any coding or changing. The only problem with network tools or network monitoring or appliance tools is that they don't catch things that happen within the database itself. So if someone logs in through SQL Plus and a backdoor password, and they make some queries or access data, that won't happen across the network, so you may not catch it. But again, maybe a combination of both to get the high volume and have the triggers. Another way to do it, and some of the database tools vendors have some tools to look at and scrape the log files, the database logs. What's nice about database logs is that they're tamper-proof. They store every database transaction, every change, and the logs are used to restore databases from a crash or a corruption. So I mean, without these logs, these databases are completely vulnerable. So they do handle a lot of the data, and it's a good way to look at what's happened in the database without impacting performance. So this is a good tool to use when you have a high performance environment and you don't want to use triggers. But for the most part, triggers really do the trick because they're in there no matter who's accessing what data and changing it. You'll know because you're controlling things at the object level. So let's take a look at a couple of examples of auditing data changes or unusual access. So the first event is, say a DBA logs into a database using SQL Plus and changes the payroll value from 10 to 20. That change would be logged if you're using a trigger or if you were using a log file, or even if you had a network sniffer technology and they logged in through something across the network, you'd pick up that change. if the person logged in through the Oracle e-Business Suite HR application and gave the guy a raise, that would be picked up, but it would say, yep, this is done by a normal user with an apps, and it would just log it and say this has been done. But you could set it up so that filters would say this change happened and it didn't happen by the application. So this could be flagged and automatically send an event to someone who needs to be accessed or notified that this happened. Another event might be, a DBA logs on to the database using a backdoor and does a select star on credit card information. That's probably an unusual query for a credit card because most of the time it's usually specifically accessing a specific credit card number. This may be a bad example with credit cards because most credit card information is required to be encrypted. But again, the idea is that a select star from where you're trying to pull a bunch of data out of the database is usually an unusual event. So that kind of access would be flagged. So all of this data gets should get archived to an audit repository so that what some customers want is they want an auditor to review a daily report. So that anything that happens, it's a report that gets generated and archived so that you have it in case you get, in case some audit process happens and you need to show what kind of controls you have in place. But you also want to make sure that whatever you're doing, you can have some exception or some type of trigger event so that if something bad happened, that exceptions are mailed or paged to the chief security officer, whoever needs to be notified. Another type of auditing process that is recommended is to implement some type of vulnerability assessment process, and this should be part of your standard change control or patch management process. Here, what we're talking about is let's use the example of DBA applies an update to patch to your production environment, but it resets a password, some default password, and it never gets reset. So, this is a scenario where you could run some scripts against that environment after you apply a patch that should detect, some of the most common vulnerabilities. And there are books and MetaLink documents out there that tell you all the things that you need to check for. Another scenario might be, say a patch was applied, but it was applied to one database but not to another, and that was a security patch. So you want to also, make sure that you're running scripts to make sure that the patches are applied to all the environments, so that if it didn't get applied to a specific database, that vulnerability is flagged and it also gets archived to the repository. So these are a couple of examples of what I would call system-level auditing, or for vulnerability assessment, and is absolutely essential as part of making sure that you kind of prevent some of the unauthorized access, by putting in some simple scripts to check basic vulnerabilities. So we talked about implementing audit controls in your production environment and vulnerability assessments. Another best practice is to secure the data that's in your test and development environment by masking it. And you can use a couple of options. Using encryption in your production environment is great for data at rest, but if you make clones of that environment, using encryption and not providing the key for test and development may not necessarily work for test and development processes, because you may have some type of forms validation or something that may check to see what the actual data values are, and if it's a bunch of funny characters, that may fail the actual test. So you need to have a couple of algorithms that make sense depending on the type of data. And we spend a lot of time talking to auditors and security officers and even analysts, and they all say that it's consistent that this area is the next target for auditors for either failing internal inspections or third-party reviews. So it's just, you really need to look at making masking an automated part of that cloning process. So when you do implement data masking, there's a couple of required features that you want to make sure that are part of your project. The obvious one is you want to make sure that you alter the data so people who are doing your tests are not able to determine the actual values. One-way data scrambling, random data generation, blah blah blah. But the other thing is that you want to make sure that you maintain functional appearance, and I mentioned this in the previous slide, but it's really to make sure that you don't impact any QA or development processes. So, for example, substitution is great for like email, or you can use a regular expression, because if someone's going to be looking at a form and they see a bunch of strange characters, it's not going to be legible to them to say, oh yeah, this is an email address and this is what it's supposed to be. So that's where encryption may not necessarily work, but there are some scenarios where encryption's great, where you can encrypt the data, send it out for test and development, and then have the result development environment sent back, and then have the people on the inside with authorized access decrypt the data to make sure that the development process was valid. Another key ingredient to data masking is to make sure that you maintain transaction relational integrity. So if the sensitive data is part of a primary foreign key relationship, if you mask primary data or data that's part of a primary foreign key, you want to make sure that it's masked consistently throughout the relationship, so that if you have any type of summarizations or anything like that, it'll continue to work, and you're not breaking the application. And the most important thing is the way that you set up the policies needs to be different than those who are actually executing the test and development. It's kind of like the fox watching the hen house syndrome. The policies need to be easy to set up and easy to use, but they need to be difficult to hack. So the best scenario is where you have a policy console where someone can define it, push a button, not have to write any code, but the actual encryption takes place during that cloning process, or masking, whatever, during that cloning process, so that the results are just displayed, and they can't hack into the system and find out what the original values were. Another best practice is to archive data in your production database. There's a lot of benefits other than reducing risk, but what I mean by database archiving, what I mean is use the business logic that's based on the application to classify your data, and then move that archive eligible data out of that production environment into a separate online available and secure archive. When you do that, you remove that data out of your production and out of all the clones, and it puts it into one secure environment. There's a lot of benefits for doing this. There's a lot of solutions out there that provide this capability, but you want to make sure that those solutions provide seamless access to that archive data through the native application or through some reporting environment. Because the data is archived, you still want to make sure it's available and online. And there's a lot of benefits to doing this, in addition to reducing risk. And one of them is that with a smaller production database, you're going to see reduced downtimes during upgrade. You'll have lower TCO because your disk requirements are going to be significantly reduced. When you take all that dead weight out of the production environment, it improves the application performance and CPU utilization. Your backups and your restore windows are going to be smaller. There's a ton of value for doing archiving. In addition, it's reducing the number of copies that sensitive data is into one secure archive. So archiving has a lot of benefits, and it's highly recommended to just get control over where the data is and putting it into one place and securing it. A lot of customers that we speak to are migrating or consolidating their applications into either single global instances or reducing the number of production applications that they have to reduce the number of vendors. One way to start looking at compliance in your legacy applications is to migrate data that's in these legacy applications to your production environment, which probably most of you are doing, but also look at the data that needs to be archived to XML or to some application-independent format that needs to be around for a long time. And then, purge and delete any of the data that doesn't need to be around. Once you've classified, migrated production data to that production environment, archived data to the to an XML file, you can sunset those application binaries. Just get rid of that environment altogether. That's benefits because you're consolidating again, your data center, technology. If you've got legacy applications that are running on old data systems and old operating systems and platforms, and if something happens and you need to access that data, and you can't get support or something broke and you can't bring that system online, there's a huge risk with that. So, look at the data. The data is the stuff that you really need to protect, not the application itself. You can always reproduce the reports and show that you have complete access to it, or prove if you put the data into an XML file and store it on tape or some type of worm media or content addressable storage to prove non-repudiation, that's perfect, because XML data is survivable. It lasts. It's independent of the application, the version of the operating system, the database, and it's in a machine-readable language or machine-readable text and open format that will last longer than probably most of the technologies that you're deploying today. So application sunsetting and migrating the production data, is definitely one thing that can help mitigate risk for those legacy applications. So it wouldn't be a vendor awareness session if we didn't have a plug about the solutions that we're providing. So Solix Technologies Enterprise Data Management Suite solves a lot of the challenges that we talked about and provides a solution for all of the best practices that were presented in this webinar, but does it in a way that it can be accomplished with a single tool. Our approach is to map the metadata for your business applications, and then use one tool and one install to help audit or secure your test and development environments, archive your data, or sunset your legacy applications. So a single tool, single install. It allows you to kind of consolidate the control, so you create your policies in one place, and this makes you much more efficient. So that way, you enable the functions as you need them, and then because you've got one location for your metadata, you can leverage that investment. If you start with enterprise archiving and you roll out security or data auditing later, you can leverage the investment in mapping that metadata over and over again and as you need it. So Solix Enterprise Data Management Suite is a unified platform that provides complete compliance and information lifecycle management solutions. So Solix's Enterprise Data Management Suite is comprised of a few products, but the core of the technology is based off of our Enterprise Metadata Manager. This is the piece where you map the metadata to your business applications. It's delivered pre-populated with some of the more popular applications like Oracle E-Business Suite and PeopleSoft, and then on top of that we have our compliance and ILM solutions. So on the compliance side, our secure test and development solution combines three pieces. One is the data masking process, or the data security. We map that to the metadata, the tables and the columns that need to be masked or secured, and we integrate that and automate it with the database cloning process. And then if you want to make multiple copies where maybe it's only a subset of that data, instant subsetting is a component to that solution. On the auditing side, Solix Data Auditing provides the ability to monitor and audit your data activity. We do have the ability to trigger alerts if something unusual happens. And because we're archiving that audit report to a central repository, that information can be very easily queried for any type of forensic reporting if something happened and you need to dig through and find out who accessed what data when. And that same auditing process is available so that when you want to audit the cloning process, we keep track of all of the steps that were made during the cloning process, the data security process, and instant subsetting. So you have a complete electronic paper trail. And then on the information lifecycle management side, we do have our Enterprise Archiving Suite, which is based off of, if you're familiar with Solix Technologies, we used to brand it as the Archive Genie product. It is now part of our Enterprise Archiving solutions. And this combines not only database archiving for custom applications, but archiving solutions for Oracle E-Business Suite and PeopleSoft and JD Edwards, and we're continuing to roll out application support for more of the Oracle customer base like we have on our roadmap. We also support the ability to archive on non-Oracle databases like DB2, SQL Server, really any database that has a JDBC driver, all from one single platform. And if archiving isn't really what you need, and say you have a data warehouse and you just want to be able to tier the data, we offer the ability to separate the data using database partitions. And this is perfect for those tables that can be partitioned based on a date or some type of range key within the database. We have reports and document and email archiving capability as well. Most of the applications that you're running, you're probably generating reports. Those same documents should be archived, to the same platform and the same lifecycle as the data that's in the database. So we've combined that solution and made it all searchable. So if you've archived, invoices or documents and attachments with your data, and you need to search for where is that information, we have an integrated search capability through our partnership with Google. And then through our services-led engagements, we provide, project engagements for those one-off solutions where you want to, sunset, a few applications and you're migrating to, say, Oracle Business Suite, or you're migrating to a single global instance, and we provide that service as well. So it is Solix's goal to simplify your jobs by making this process manageable through a central policy console. The entire enterprise data management suite is all managed through one console, where you set up the metadata once, and then you define your policies, whether it's SOX policies or privacy or internal audits. Those are all done within the browser-based user interface, and we support segregation of duties because the technology has role-based authorization and access. We provide the mapping so that if you define your SOX policy, it may have a combination of auditing or masking or archiving functions, and all of the policies are enforced at the data tier. We do support heterogeneous data centers, so we have support for the major RDBMS vendors, and it's extensible to allow you to define your own custom policy. So if there's a policy that you need to extend or enhance, it's a very open architecture, so you can add that. And we are integrated with the more popular archiving platforms such as EMC Centera and IBM DR550. We have integrated search to make that archive searchable, so that if you do need to retrieve data or restore it, it's very easily done within the tool. And if you have implemented tiered storage, we can take advantage of that by migrating or archiving the data to that tiered platform. So let's take a quick look at the console that we're talking about. And the first screenshot we're looking at here is an example of within Oracle Financials, a payables example where we've pre-populated the knowledge base with the payables metadata for Oracle Business Suite. And it shows all the tables that are part of that payables business object and all the relationships, the parent-child relationships. That same metadata or that payables information is then leveraged to define, in this example, an audit policy. Here we're mapping to our AP payment history all, and we're going to, in this example, we're looking at masking. So we're going to be masking the bank transaction amount information. You select the rule type and the security rule, and whether or not you want decryption allowed. And this is tied to that same metadata repository. Another example is if you wanted to implement an audit policy, again leveraging that same knowledge base. In this example, we're looking at auditing the PO amount limit. And here we're going to use a trigger. So we've selected the option of it's either going to be a database audit or it's a table or a column trigger audit. And here we have the option to look at on inserts, on updates, or on deletes. So you define what it is that you want to be auditing. And there's also the additional capability to filter out, like if, for example, if it's over or under a certain percentage, then you can have an event notification. So to wrap it up, by combining compliance and tiered storage, in securing your environment, there's a lot of additional benefits by lowering, by reducing that production size, by archiving. and placing that information on your tier 1, you can start to leverage tiers of service based on that archive classification. And then you migrate that archive data and your test and development environments that have been masked, and including your audit logs there, into a secure environment that is residing on Tier 2. You can significantly lower your total cost by having the bulk of the data that doesn't have to be on Tier 1 on Tier 2, which can introduce a lot of savings. And then by reducing the amount of data in your production and in your clones, you're also going to see some reduction in your tape volumes. So the secure data that was in production is masked in all your copies. It can be protected in that secure environment. And then if you're backing up all those test and development environments, the data will be secure in your backup environments as well. So just by implementing some of these best policies, instant subsetting, archiving, and auditing, we've seen our customers reduce their tier 1 costs anywhere from 50 to 60%, and tape volumes by as much as 50%. And then you'll also see some of the other benefits of improved application performance, improved operational efficiencies, and you'll see that you're better able to utilize your resources in your data center in a secure fashion too. So one of our customers is a market-leading logistics company. They had a requirement to secure their data and lower their costs because they were outsourcing their data center to a third party. They had a Oracle e-Business Suite environment with HR payroll, and they needed to mask their HR payroll data before releasing it to their outsourced data center. So they had a requirement to mask their sensitive data. In addition, they were being charged by the outsourcer for how long it took to create their clones, as well as the amount of storage that was required to store them. So they had an initiative to reduce their chargeback costs. So by implementing our solution, we were able to mitigate the risk because we sanitized the data by masking it as part of a cloning process. And because we automated the cloning process and removed all of the manual steps, we were able to take their process from 11 days down to less than 11 hours. We also reduced their storage requirements by approximately 50%. So they saw an immediate payback because their chargebacks from the outsourced data center was significantly reduced. And that was all done as a part of a phase 1. And then because we had the metadata already mapped, now they're beginning phase 2 of archiving because it was a lot easier to add on that feature because they'd already established the metadata and the processes with their secure test and dev solution. So here is a good example of securing their environment and leveraging that investment to do future archiving. So if you would like to learn more information about how this particular customer achieved savings and lowered their risk while staying compliant, or if you're just more interested in the solutions that we talked about today, please visit us at our website at www.solix.com, or call us to speak with one of our solution representatives, 888-GO-SOLIX, SOLIX, or email us at info@solix.com. We want to thank you for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you at the upcoming OAUG show or Collaborate show in Las Vegas, Nevada in April. Thanks again, and have a great day.